Okay, so you want to own a prison. In 2016, the largest private prison company in America lost 35% of its value in a single afternoon. Not because crime dropped, not because prisoners escaped, not because one of their prisons failed, because the wrong person won an election. 4 years later, the stock recovered almost immediately after the next election. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why private prisons are one of the only businesses in America where billions of dollars depend less on the product and more on who controls the government. The business itself is deceptively simple. The government supplies the inmates and pays you per prisoner per day. You don't investigate crimes. You don't sentence anyone. You don't decide how long people stay. You just own the building, manage the facility, and collect the check. And for decades, that turned private prisons into one of the most profitable government outsourcing businesses in America. But there's a catch. Unlike almost every other industry, your revenue doesn't really depend on customers choosing your product. It depends on political policy. One administration expands detention. Another tries to phase it out. One election can wipe out billions in shareholder value overnight. And that's exactly what happened. Because once you understand how these companies actually make money, the incentives underneath the entire system start to look very different. There are basically 3 levels to this business. At the bottom, county jail management contracts. The government already owns the building. You take over operations, reduce staffing costs, cut expenses where possible, and keep the margin. Entry cost, maybe $5 to $10 million. Mid-tier is where the real money starts. A 1,500-bed immigration detention center costs around $90 million to build. ICE contracts can pay anywhere from $120 to over $200 per detainee per day. At roughly 90% occupancy, that can generate more than $70 million in annual revenue from a single facility. Then there's the top tier, full federal correctional institutions, 2,500 beds, 20-year contracts, hundreds of millions in construction costs. These are essentially infrastructure projects disguised as prisons. But there's a problem nobody mentions in the sales pitch. Your facility could be perfectly profitable, fully occupied, running exactly as expected, and still lose a massive percentage of its value because of a single policy announcement from Washington. That's the risk underneath the entire business. The modern private prison industry basically begins with one man, Tom Beasley, former chairman of the Tennessee Republican Party. In 1983, Beasley flew to Nashville with an idea that sounded absurd at the time. What if a private company ran prisons for profit? He reportedly offered to take over Tennessee's entire prison system. Every facility, every inmate, one contract. The state rejected the full proposal, but officials were curious enough to offer a smaller pilot program instead. Within a year, Beasley secured his first detention contract in Houston, Texas. 350 immigration detainees, paid at a rate of $23.50 per person per day. That company eventually became Core Civic. Today, it generates nearly $2 billion annually. And the model that built it was incredibly straightforward. The government sends people in. The company bills the government every day they stay there. That's it. No product development, no consumer demand, no innovation cycle. Just contracts, occupancy, and time. Now, let's say you own a 1,500-bed detention facility. Day 1. Nobody has even arrived yet. You still need hundreds of employees working around the clock. Correctional officers, medical staff, administration, food service, maintenance. Payroll alone can cost tens of millions per year. Then healthcare, because once someone enters your facility, you become legally responsible for their medical treatment. That means chronic illness, emergency care, mental health treatment, medication, then utilities, insurance, food, compliance audits, transportation. Before a single government payment arrives, your annual operating costs can already exceed $40 million. And then there's the expense nobody wants to talk about: lawsuits. If someone dies in custody, the liability doesn't disappear into the system. It lands on the operator. Wrongful death settlements can cost millions. And over time, those lawsuits become part of the operating math. This is why occupancy matters so much, because these facilities are incredibly expensive to keep running, whether they're full or half empty. The entire industry runs on one mechanism: the per diem rate. The government pays a fixed amount per inmate per day. That's the engine. Federal corrections contracts might pay under $100 per day. ICE detention contracts often pay much more. Some exceed $200 daily for each detainee. But the real story isn't the daily rate, it's the occupancy guarantees. Many contracts guarantee that prisons stay a certain percentage full: 80%, 90%, sometimes even 100%, which means the government agrees to pay for beds whether they're occupied or not. Think about what that does to incentives. In most industries, demand uncertainty is the biggest risk. But in this business, contracts can reduce that risk dramatically. If incarceration rates fall, if sentencing laws change, if fewer people are detained, the facility can still generate revenue. And there's another uncomfortable reality underneath all of this. The US recidivism rate is extremely high. A large percentage of released prisoners eventually return to the system. For society, that's a failure. For a prison operator, it stabilizes long-term demand. There are three huge misconceptions about private prisons. First, people assume they're dramatically cheaper than public prisons. That was the original sales pitch. But many studies have challenged that claim. One reason is that operators can shift expensive inmates, especially serious medical cases, back into the public system where costs explode. Second, most people think violent criminals are the most profitable prisoners. They're not. Immigration detention became one of the industry's most profitable segments. Civil detainees, not convicted criminals. Why? Higher rates, simpler facilities, lower long-term costs. For companies like GEO Group and Core Civic, immigration enforcement became central to the business model. And third, people assume these companies are passive contractors. They aren't. Both major operators have spent years lobbying around sentencing laws, detention policy, and immigration enforcement. Because unlike most businesses, government policy doesn't just affect demand, it creates it. In 2003, a judge named Mark Ciavarella began sentencing children in Pennsylvania. One teenager made a fake MySpace page mocking her school principal. She ended up in juvenile detention. Over the next several years, thousands of children were sent into detention facilities for relatively minor offenses. Later, investigators uncovered the reason. The judges overseeing those cases had received millions of dollars in kickbacks tied to private juvenile detention centers. One facility filled up. The companies operating it got paid. The judges received money in return. The scandal became known as Kids for Cash. Eventually, thousands of convictions were overturned. The judges went to prison, but the underlying business model survived. The same per diem structure still exists today, and the core incentive never changed. The longer people stay in detention, the more money the facility generates. Now we get back to the stock collapse. August 18th, 2016. The Department of Justice announces plans to phase out private federal prison contracts. That single memo erased over $1 billion in combined shareholder value from the two biggest prison companies before markets even closed. No prison failed, no riots, no escapes, no operational disaster, just policy risk. Then Donald Trump won the election a few months later. The phase-out was reversed. The stocks recovered. Then the Biden administration moved to phase private prisons out again. Then another political reversal happened after the next election cycle. This is the part that makes the industry so unusual. A restaurant depends on customers. A tech company depends on products. A prison company depends on political ideology. That's the real asset. Not the buildings, not the guards, not even the inmates, the policy environment. Back in 1983, Tom Beasley started with 350 detainees in Houston. Today, the private prison industry generates billions every year. The companies behind it manufacture nothing. They invent nothing. They simply take custody of people delivered by the government and charge daily rates until those people leave. The contracts are long-term. The cash flow can be enormous, and under the right administration, the business can be incredibly profitable. But every dollar depends on one assumption: that the government continues believing incarceration is something worth outsourcing to private companies. A casino has a built-in advantage because the math favors the house. This industry has a built-in advantage because policy can guarantee demand. But unlike math, policy changes, and every 4 years, the entire business waits to see which direction the country votes next.